Ahora vamos a movernos a la parte de los comentarios que van a ser provistos por el doctor Julio Santaella. Julio Santaella es presidente de la Junta de Gobierno del INEGI, licenciado en Economía por el Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, el ITAM, así como maestro y doctor en Economía por la Universidad de California en Los Ángeles. De 2001 a 2014 se desempeñó en el Banco de México como coordinador ejecutivo del Fondo Mexicano del Petróleo para la Estabilización y el Desarrollo, como gerente de Información y Análisis y director del apoyo a las operaciones de Banca Central y como investigador en la Dirección General de Investigación Económica y en la Junta de Gobierno. En el ámbito académico, ha sido investigador y docente del ITAM de 1985-86 y 1997 a 2003. Encabezó la coordinación del Centro de Economía Aplicada, encabezó la jefatura del Departamento Académico de Economía y fue director adjunto en el Centro de Análisis e Investigación Económica. Durante el periodo 1992 a 97 fue economista del Departamento de Investigación y Departamento Europeo del Fondo Monetario Internacional. De 1984 a 87 fue jefe del Departamento de Política Macroeconómica de la Dirección General de Planeación Hacendaria de la Secretaría de Hacienda y Crédito Público. Sin más, te doy la palabra, Julio.
Muchas gracias, Chele, por esa amable presentación. I'm going to switch to English so that the presenter understands. It's been a pleasure reading and listening the presentation by Paul, which, by the way, I also thank him because of the peer review of the recommendation on statistics that the OECD is undertaking for our national statistical system. So it's a double thanks that he's here, in this case talking about the measurement of GDP in a digitalized economy. It's really a fascinating topic, and it was not said explicitly, but it's in the references of the paper. This is based also in some work that he's been doing at several parts, but especially in the forum with Nadim Ahmed. It's the main reference. What are the main ideas that are explored in this paper? The first one is, of course, motivating the whole issue is this labor productivity puzzle. And the question is whether their mismeasurement hypothesis or phenomena that it's explaining that labor productivity puzzle. And let me just remark that, especially for people that are not have an economic background, the importance of this labor productivity puzzle. Many times we put together what happens to labor productivity, to the marginal product of labor and wages. So the connection between labor productivity and wages, and therefore earnings for households, and what goes with that, like income distribution and consumer potential acquisition, it's very important to understand what's happening to this labor productivity. Now, within this discussion, it's clear that the digital economy opens different interactions, relationships between different agents, and Paul has given us some examples where there's lower transaction costs in certain of these transactions, where potentially there should be higher productivity, at least that's apparent from the benefits that as consumers we get. And the thing is that many of these issues are really not new to official statistics. Paul commented, for instance, some of this informal economy, but the thing is that with the digital economy, things have actually grown exponentially. So the scale is what really is probably making an impact. And that's something that is very important to understand, and therefore that's why it was considered to be one possible reason behind this labor productivity puzzle. The question is whether there are new ways or there's a new need for additional measurement of GDP and of course also of productivity, because these are two different things that are closely related, but we should keep them in mind. Paul clearly specifies that this debate is blurred by different types of issues, whether they're conceptual elements that have to be clearly defined, that are completely different from measurement or statistical dimensions of these concepts in terms of measurement. The second hot topic that I think is very important from this paper is the clear distinction between GDP and welfare. Unfortunately, GDP is the star of the national accounts, and it gets all the headlines in the news, but it's not as important for us from a social point of view as welfare. So therefore, it's something that we have to keep in mind when we're trying to understand the well-being of a whole societies. It's not completely captured by GDP. And another important element is what happens between prices and quantities, which is sometimes not clear, but they do have important implications. Now, these are the 5 domains that Paul discussed. I'm not going to go into the details. He talked about new intermediation of services. He talked also about how consumers are becoming themselves producers of their own services. He also talked about the new availability of free services or products to consumers that somehow have to be paid for in other means. Also, he talked about the cross-border flows, and in particular, he focused on intellectual property products. And he gave the example of Ireland, which is very impressive. And also of challenges of prices and values measurement. Now, what are the main conclusions of the paper? Just to recap, he basically says that at least at the conceptual level, GDP and productivity appear to be up to the task. I mean, so far so good. I mean, there are certain elements, there are certain opportunity areas where improvements should be made, but ideally, the concepts that we want to measure are already taken care of in GDP and productivity. Where can we have some additional improvement in terms of measurement? Well, there's this idea of in labor force surveys, for instance, capturing well the occasionally self-employed, where people come on and off the labor force and on and off different occupations. And there are several examples of them, like the Uber driver or Uber entrepreneur, for instance. Improvement needs to be done, and he made good examples of international transactions in IPPs, or intellectual property products, and also in terms of prices. I mean, hedonic prices and quality adjustment and all these kind of things are important in order. The thing is that he's also suggesting in this paper that national statistical offices should also rely on other sources of information. For instance, on the reports of digital intermediaries, for instance, of their turnover or their tax returns, or also on big data that is collected by some other intermediaries or operators. They could be either banks or telecom operators or some other firms that actually use this big data and can be used for different purposes. The example given by Paul was this of the price adjustment. And of course, he stresses that GDP is a measure of production, not welfare. There are different concepts, so we should not identify them one-on-one. Of course, the corollary is that we need to complement GDP with other well-being and welfare indicators. And he calls for national statistical offices to rely and find more basic data in order to identify better what's happening in the digital economy. That's the summary of the paper. What are my main comments or my reactions to this? In general, I'm in broad agreement with Paul's conclusions. It's a very smart paper, very well argued, good examples. Of course, he's well versed in the statistics and the conceptual elements that go behind it. So overall, I'm in agreement with him. In what remains of my comments, I would want to stress three different issues that are particular, I guess, from the Mexican economy or the Mexican context. Not all of them related to the digital economy, but topics that are particularly important with the presence of the digital economy. One has to do that the new system of national accounts that we have introduced just last week, and where there are improvements in terms of measurement. The second is, of course, the difficulty of measuring accurately and distinguishing between prices and quantities. I mean, this is a long issue, but it's, as Paul just argued, being completely made more patent in the digital economy context. And of course, cross-border flows and international transactions. This is not exclusive to the digital economy, but it's very important in order to understand many other topics related to economic activity, like location and where to impute the value added in different stages of the production chain according to this location. So let me give three comments from a Mexican perspective. The first one has to do with improvements that we have made in the system of national accounts to measure the digital economy. Just last Tuesday, we presented the new system of national accounts. It's the base year is 2013. The previous one was 2008, right? So what are the main improvements that we have made there? Let me just highlight, there are different things, but just highlight the three that I find that are more related to the digital economy. One has to do with the telecommunications sector. In this new system of national accounts, as suggested by the National Accounts Manual 2008, we have identified the value of assets related to telecommunications, and therefore imputed the income or rent that comes from those assets into the national accounts. Second has to do with e-commerce. We are having an estimation that I'm going to talk a little bit more into detail about this e-commerce, where we based our estimations on certain information that we gather on the 2014 economic census that allow us to identify specifically what we call internet sales. That's what we identify as e-commerce. And in terms of ICT, or information and communication technologies, we're also identifying in a more detail the different links in the electronic platforms, in particular business to business, when these kinds of exchange are involved. Now, this is our estimation of e-commerce. The more precise information is from reference to 2013, the base year for the system of national accounts. Of course, on top of it, we have a quote from the paper by Nadim and Paul. E-commerce transactions within an economy, in particular when at least one of the two parties is a registered enterprise, should present no difficulty for GDP measurement other than transactions conducted from other types of modes. So in a way, this should already be, for the most part, included into the measurement of GDP. The thing is that the modality through which these transactions are taken care of is through electronic means. Now, the estimation that we have is that e-commerce accounts for around 3% of GDP in 2013. About equal shares between actual commerce, and that's both at the wholesale and the retailing level. this interchange of goods and services, but also in terms of services provided directly through the internet, like airplane tickets or hotel reservations and the like. Those services also account and a little bit more than half. Now, we're in this chart, I'm showing an estimation of the extrapolation of different values and quantities in order to have an estimation of e-commerce through the history of the last 13 years. And you can see that it's growing at least according to this estimation almost exponentially now. It's likely that last year e-commerce should accounted for more than 6% of GDP. So this shows that it's very important to keep track of these things, and therefore we have to continue making efforts to measure as good as possible this kind of phenomena. Another related question has to do with what's happening to the telecommunications sector. Here we have the telecom share in gross value added, not GDP, but closely related gross value added. And we can see from, let's say, 2003 to 2008, 2009, there was a growing trend where telecommunications was increasing its share in terms of value added in the whole economy. But after that, what we see is that value, the share of telecommunications has come down quite sharply, so that by last account, last year, value added in telecom was less than at the beginning of this time reference. So this is a very dynamic sector where important changes in quantities and qualities of the services are occurring at the same time as changes in prices. So the argument here is that we have to be very careful in measuring these activities, because we can very easily make different inferences with different assumptions regarding prices and quantities. This is, for instance, our estimation of the implicit price deflator for this sector, for telecommunications, subsector 517 in the national account system. So we can see that basically in this period there's a 50% drop in prices in the implicit price deflator of this sector. So probably the sharpest decline started precisely in 2009, when the share of the sector in gross value added started to decline. So that decline has more to do with prices rather than with quantities, okay? Now, we do not have very precise estimates on some of these issues, so we have to make strong assumptions in order to come up with these estimations. Of course, for those of you that are familiar, in the meantime, we have had telecommunication reform in our country that has to be related with the economic phenomena that is happening behind these things. A separate source of information comes from our telecom regulator, the IFT, or Institute for Federal Telecommunications, where you can see that basically in only 1 year, from 2015 to 2016, there's a huge change in the type of data that is traveling from 3G to 4G. So there's a constant revolution within this industry that suggests that precisely it's a very dynamic, and we have to keep good track of what's happening. So the argument again is that we have to be very careful with the measurement of quantities of these intangible services and with their corresponding prices. The final comment, the third comment that I wanted to make, has to do with cross-border transactions. In his paper or the presentation, Paul talked or concentrated on intellectual property products. This issue is not, is also in terms of, it applies also to Mexico, But I would say that in Mexico, we do have a more general issue with cross-border transactions that has to do with international trade in services in general. Earlier this year, we introduced the Manual 6 for the balance of payments, and we did have a better identification of different concepts, particularly in terms of services, non-financial services. But nevertheless, I want to illustrate with a figure on the right-hand side, there's still a huge chunk of information, of flows, of currency flows, that remains unexplained. The share of errors and omissions in the balance of payments as a proportion of GDP is more than 1%. So my hunch is that a part of these remaining flows to be explained are related to international trade services, or international trade in services. And the issue, of course, is particularly pertinent for digital intermediation of some services, right? When we, as Mexicans residents, either hire an apartment in Paul's Paris through Airbnb, whether that it's reflected in the balance of payments and therefore in the system of national accounts or not. So that's something important that, of course, we're looking into in the next economic census of 2019, where this is going to be a big issue and we have to improve our own measurement. So let me give final thoughts. Of course, the digital economy poses important conceptual and measurement challenges for official statistics. And the paper by Ahmad and Schreyer, Paul and Nadim better, it's identify concretely issues and poses some future agenda to work in these issues, both at the conceptual and at the empirical level. At our own National Statistical Institute, we're taking steps aimed at improving the measurement of the whole economy and in particular also of the digital economy, but still more needs to be done at the National Statistical System level, which is our, what we call the SNIEG. And of course, I would like to close saying that the larger issue of measuring welfare and well-being remains, with strong implication for traditional GDP and productivity measures. Thank you very much.
Bueno, y muchas gracias, doctor Santaella, por sus comentarios. Ahora vamos a abrir un pequeño espacio, porque ya no tenemos tanto tiempo, 7 minutitos para preguntas y respuestas del público en general. Y luego yo creo que darle también a lo mejor un espacio a Paul para que comente. Maybe we give you, we can give you like 2 or 3 minutes for you to respond as well. Entonces, bueno, primero abrimos el espacio a preguntas y respuestas. Gerardo. El doctor.
Thank you, Paul, for this very interesting presentation. My question is based on this gap that has existed since the beginning between well-being and economic activity measurement. Kuznets recognized that GDP was not an appropriate way of measuring well-being, and we also have been trying to keep up with quality changes since many years ago while we measure GDP. But in this case, as President Santaella mentioned, we face a very different scale in this kind of challenges. These new technologies poses challenges in terms of quality and in terms of new ways of satisfying needs of many people. And so at the end of your presentation, you said that GDP is up to the task. So it implies that whatever we do should be inside the boundaries of the theoretical framework of the current measurement of GDP. So basically the question is, what evidence shall we need to declare that GDP is not up for the task? And saying this, being conscious that we as producers of GDP may have some kind of bias towards keeping things business as usual. Thank you.
¿Hay alguna otra pregunta que quisieran hacer? A ver, so we take first 2 or 3 questions and then, okay, let you.
Thank you, Paul and Julio, for the excellent presentation. Just amazing quantity of information that from us public services here are like mesmerizing. I'm kind of going off topic here, but given the nature of next year's political tendency that's going to be happening here in Mexico, what is your opinion of both of you, if it's possible? If it's not, it's okay, about the social networking and the e-commerce going to influence any of the voters or any of the society here, given the particular scenery that we have, that since it's not that regulated in our legislations, and I believe there is a kind of a strong topic there about influencing people about going to certain tendencies or not with this digital commerce going on. Thank you, Paul and Julio.
Una pregunta más de este lado, por favor.
Hello, this is Gabriel Casillas from Banorte, a local-based bank. Thanks very much for the presentation, for the invitation. I think it's very interesting indeed. One thing, I'm new to this thing. Let me make 2 steps before this. Not in terms as GDP as a measurement of well-being, but more so in terms of back again to the productivity discussion. In the usual example that we have heard many times, and I assume you have heard it more times than me, that when somebody wrote a letter to somebody, everything that was involved into that, you know, from purchasing the paper and the envelope and, you know, the pen, writing it, and, you know, all the procedure all the way up to the letter arriving to the people that they wanted to send it. All these that was lost just by now sending an email. That's a productivity. In which part we're short of measuring that lack of productivity if, you know, an email is much more efficient rather than sending the whole letter. So maybe this is something you have answered like in Digital Economy 101, but, you know, I just wanted to, if you're able to share with us at least a small answer to that. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to give you the microphone so you can answer.
Thank you for these excellent questions. On GDP and welfare, of course, this, you know, is a almost philosophical issue, and of course, when we say that we're up to the task, at least, or GDP is up to the task, at least conceptually, and we are rather closely involved with national accounts, then there may be a bias towards that statement. I can see that very well. But I think the onus of showing that GDP is not up to the task lies with clearly defining what we want to measure with GDPs and providing evidence that we're getting that wrong. And what we want to measure with GDP is some measure of market production, loosely defined. Okay, And so if we have convincing evidence that either our concepts are incapable of capturing what happens on markets in terms of production, or our statistical tools, being it household surveys, business surveys, the way we construct national accounts or price statistics, are incapable of measuring, the quantity of output, then I think that should be recognized. But I guess the national accountants would be the first one to recognize that. And if you look at the whole discussions that are ongoing around that theme, I don't think these are very sort of closed discussions. I think the mindset is rather open because things are moving quickly, and we do want to follow that up. So I think it's a very legitimate question. But as I said, certainly for my part, I haven't found the smoking gun yet, where I said, oh, here's the big thing that really means that whatever we see in the national accounts has nothing to do with the quantity of market production. There are a number of areas, and I've outlined them, but I haven't found the big thing yet. And I think the onus of proving that there is an issue is certainly with those who say there is an issue, you see. But notwithstanding, I think there are many avenues where we need to work more. Also, when we move into this whole area of measuring welfare, I mean, of course, GDP is a very, very simple welfare measure as well, and more correctly, we should say, going towards more comprehensive welfare measures. Well, we need to bring in things like distribution of income, and in conjunction with the digital economy, we would also want to think about the disadvantages of the digital economy. I mean, there's also sometimes a little bit of a bias towards only seeing the fancy part of the digital economy and being a little less outspoken about the fact that digital devices also make it that you respond to your email over the weekend, okay, which didn't happen in the past, that you are carrying out production activities for the market sector, which wasn't the case in the past. There are mental health issues that are associated with well-being, with digital economy. So I think those are complex issues, and they definitely need to be investigated. A second question was about social networking influencing society. I have no comments to make, of course, about Mexico here, but I do have a comment about the fact that the national statistical offices clearly have to play a role in this whole game where opinions are formed in social media. Data is searched in social media rather than at the websites of the national statistical offices. We actually had a conference a little while ago in Paris on this very topic. What is the role of official statistics in a world where young people go to Twitter and Facebook to get their information about what is happening to the environment or to young and not so young people, yes. So the information is sought elsewhere. And there's a real sort of statistical policy issue there to make sure that we are able to communicate with the population, and certainly we should not shy away from ourselves also being involved in social media for that purpose. The third question was about productivity and letter writing. Is a great example, actually. I would answer in two ways. One is, yes, if you don't write the letter with pencil and paper anymore, but send an email, that indeed is something that some production will disappear and will move out into the household sector. But if you have these, that's an efficiency gain. If you don't spend your time going for the paper and writing it out and copying, you should be able to use your time at work differently. And the question is, why don't we see this in the productivity figure of the firm that has moved to email, to use that example? And I think that is that paradox is still there that we can't see.
Un breve comentario nada más, respondiendo a la pregunta de este lado. Creo que la respuesta es muy sencilla, pues evidentemente va a ser un factor, ¿no? Ya ha sido, como ha sido en otros países, sociedades del mundo, la economía y la sociedad de la información y los medios electrónicos pues ya están permeando en nuestra sociedad, así que cualquier cosa que ocurra allí pues tiene que ser un factor para el proceso de los procesos, supongo que te refieres a los políticos del 2018, pero también para muchos otros eventos que están ocurriendo, ¿no? De hecho, tuvimos un pico en mensajes en redes sociales a raíz de los sismos de septiembre, ¿no? Entonces, digamos, esto de alguna manera pues ya es una infraestructura, un modus de operación, entonces pues va a ser un elemento. Aquí quizá me gustaría nada más retomar lo que comentaba Paul, en el sentido de cuál debe ser el papel de las estadísticas oficiales en este contexto, ¿no? Lo que nosotros queremos es que la información que se difunda a través de redes sociales o cualquier otro medio, pues esté basada en datos que tienen apego a la realidad, que son verificados, que tienen un fundamento riguroso, metodológico, conceptual, y no son nada más aseveraciones al vapor, ¿no? Estando en una conferencia de índole con un temas económicos, me gustaría usar la parábola de la burbuja, ¿no? En los mercados financieros. Esos fenómenos, lo que hemos visto es que la formación de expectativas puede alejar la determinación de los precios de sus fundamentos económicos, ¿no? Aquí el símil sería que nosotros quisiéramos que las discusiones no se alejaran de pura perspectiva y que regresaran al fundamento estadístico que está basado en los datos reales que están medidos verdaderamente, ¿no? Eso es muy importante en este debate y en la formación, y como comentaba Paul, pues tenemos una agenda muy importante, ver cómo podemos reforzar nuestras agendas de comunicación para que la información oficial, la información fuerte, dura, pues sea la que esté en el centro de las discusiones y no nada más algunas percepciones. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Le agradecemos a los panelistas por su participación. Les vamos a dar un regalito. Parte de la IBERO.